The year was 1861, and Washington, D.C. was less a capital city and more a sprawling, anxious military encampment. The unfinished dome of the Capitol building loomed over the city, a potent symbol of a union tragically incomplete, its promised perfection shattered by the secession of Southern states. This was the volatile stage upon which Abraham Lincoln, a man born of humble origins and possessing an often melancholy disposition, was forced to play the role of the nation's savior. His inauguration was not a triumph but a tense, heavily guarded affair, a stark acknowledgement that the country was not simply experiencing political turbulence, but an outright civil war. His predecessor, James Buchanan, had left him an administration paralyzed by indecision, and the moment Lincoln took the oath of office, he inherited the most profound crisis in American history. The very air of the White House, the executive mansion, was thick with fear, ambition, and the acrid smell of coal smoke and gunpowder from the nearby skirmishes. Lincoln, standing at $6 for $1, physically dominated any room he entered, yet he was often described as a man carrying the weight of the entire Union on his shoulders. He spent countless hours within the walls of the White House, which served as his office, his sanctuary, and often his prison. It was in the second-floor Oval Room, later to become the Lincoln Bedroom, that he drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, pacing the floorboards late into the night, wrestling with the moral and constitutional implications of his actions. Every piece of furniture, every dark oil portrait hanging on the walls, witnessed the slow erosion of his health and spirit as casualty lists grew longer. The executive mansion itself was a microcosm of the divided nation. While the ground floor was dedicated to official business, cabinet meetings, military planning, and receiving ambassadors, the upstairs was a fragile family home. Here, Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, grappled with the private devastations of the war, culminating in the agonizing loss of their beloved son, Willie, to typhoid fever in 1862. The grief-stricken parents conducted Willie's funeral right there in the East Room, forever imbuing the residents with a profound sense of personal tragedy that mirrored the national tragedy unfolding outside its gates. The legacy Lincoln was forging was one of immense suffering and ultimate preservation. He was the commander-in-chief, the chief mourner, and the spiritual anchor for a democracy tearing itself apart. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the immense sacrifice required to hold the Union together would forever tie his spirit to this house, the nerve center of the conflict. The war's end and his subsequent, untimely death would only solidify the legend, ensuring that the heavy burden he bore in life would, in an ethereal form, continue to linger long after his final breath. The Capitol was divided, the nation was divided, and the White House became the charged vessel holding the sorrowful, tenacious spirit of the man who refused to let either fall. The war was a constant, suffocating reality within the White House walls. It was not merely an abstract conflict reported in newspapers. It was a physical presence that seeped into the very structure of the building. The second floor, meant for rest, was perpetually converted into a war room, with large maps spread across tables, their surfaces pinpricked with the rapidly shifting front lines of Virginia and beyond. Lincoln's days were a relentless cycle of military conferences, telegrams reporting defeats, and the heartbreaking duty of signing execution orders for deserting soldiers. The pressure on the 16th president was multifaceted, an unrelenting vice grip. He faced not only the organized might of the Confederate Army, but also the internal treachery and skepticism from his own side. His cabinet was a collection of rivals he had shrewdly brought together, men like Secretary of State William Seward and Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, who often doubted his competence and even schemed against him. The radical Republicans viewed him as too slow or too moderate on emancipation, while the Democrats saw him as a tyrant destroying the Union under the guise of saving it. Every decision, from appointing a general to issuing a bond, was met with fierce, often public, criticism. The weight of these responsibilities etched deeper lines into Lincoln's already weary face. His gaunt frame seemed to shrink under the weight of command. He rarely slept soundly, and often the only respite he found was wandering the White House corridors late at night, a solitary, melancholy figure wrapped in a shawl. It was during these hours, when the gaslights cast long, dancing shadows, that he confronted the true cost of his leadership. The telegrams piled high on his desk were not just statistics. They represented thousands of young men, fathers, sons, brothers, who would never return home. This profound sense of personal responsibility for the carnage was a burden no political leader had ever faced with such intimacy. He had a particularly difficult relationship with his generals. He cycled through commanders, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, searching desperately for a man who possessed both the strategic insight and the will to crush the rebellion decisively. The frustration over the Army of the Potomac's continual failures was often audible, manifesting in angry outbursts or quiet despair. He would pace his office, muttering about the general's inability to move, feeling the urgency of the war while his subordinates acted with excessive caution. It was this relentless pressure, the political backstabbing, the military failures, the public grief, that defined his occupancy of the White House. He was consumed by the war, mentally, emotionally, and physically. He would later confide to a friend that he often felt compelled to seek advice, not from living counselors, but from the very ghosts of the American past, who seemed to inhabit the old executive mansion. This deep, almost psychic connection to the tragic fate of the Union, and his willingness to endure the unimaginable stress to save it, laid the groundwork for the enduring legend of his spectral return. He was too consumed by his work to truly leave it, even in death. April 14, 1865. Good Friday. The atmosphere in Washington was one of giddy, almost unbelievable relief. Only 5 days earlier, Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, effectively ending the most devastating war in American history. The 4 years of bloodshed, stress, and anxiety that had dominated the White House were finally over. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln ventured out for a night of simple enjoyment, attending a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. The presidential box, draped with American flags and an engraved portrait of George Washington, offered a false sense of security. Lincoln, tired but finally at peace, leaned back in his rocking chair, holding his wife's hand. He was planning for Reconstruction, for the monumental task of reuniting the broken nation. The weight on his shoulders had lifted, only to be replaced by a profound, hopeful exhaustion. The audience cheered him upon his entrance, recognizing not just a president, but a triumphant savior. But the night's gaiety was an illusion, a moment of fragile American happiness about to be violently torn apart. While the crowd roared with laughter at a pivotal line delivered on stage, a carefully chosen moment of maximum noise, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and ardent Confederate sympathizer, slipped through the unguarded door of the box. He was an intimate figure of the Washington theater scene, his presence near the box hardly raising an alarm. The familiarity of the theater, a place of entertainment, masked its sudden transformation into a site of profound national tragedy. At point-blank range, Booth fired a single shot from a small Derringer pistol into the back of the president's head. The comedy ceased instantly. The sound, muffled by the crowd's cheer a second before, now echoed like a thunderclap of doom. Chaos erupted, turning the celebratory theater into a screaming hell. Booth leaped from the box to the stage, breaking his leg but escaping into the night, leaving the entire capital city in a state of immediate, horrified shock. The unconscious president, too tall to lie flat on the bed, was carried not back to the familiar, comforting walls of the White House, but to a modest boarding house across the street, the Peterson House. There, in a small, cramped back bedroom, the leader of the free world lay dying, surrounded by cabinet members, doctors, and the intense grief of his wife. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took charge, turning the room into an impromptu command center. Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. the following morning, April 15, 1865. His final hours were spent inches from the common people he had devoted his life to saving, his long frame resting diagonally on a short bed. The sudden, brutal end to the man who had suffered so intensely in the White House ensured that his tenure was not only defined by his successes, but by his sacrifice. His spirit, having endured 4 years of agony in the executive mansion, was now ripped from his body right on its doorstep. The journey that his coffin would soon take back to the White House would mark the beginning of a profound, spiritual haunting, a return to the place he could never truly escape. The return of Abraham Lincoln to the White House was not a homecoming, but a procession of immense, silent sorrow. On April 15, 1865, the body of the assassinated president was borne across the street from the Peterson House and brought back to the executive mansion, the place where he had labored and agonized for 4 long years. The atmosphere was one of profound, paralyzing grief. Every door and window was draped in heavy black crepe, transforming the once vibrant symbol of the Republic into a somber, silent mausoleum. The scent of funeral flowers and decay hung heavy in the spring air, an olfactory reminder of the nation's wound. The East Room, where Willie Lincoln's small funeral had been held 3 years prior, was now prepared for the lying-in state. A catafalque was constructed, and the public, weeping and stunned, began their slow, agonizing march past the closed coffin. The line of mourners stretched for blocks, a testament to the fact that the man who had been reviled by so many in life was now universally revered in death. This house, the scene of so much political maneuvering and personal suffering, was now sanctified by martyrdom. For Mary Todd Lincoln, the grief was unbearable. She refused to leave her bed upstairs for weeks, immobilized by the twin tragedies of losing a son and a husband within the White House walls. The rooms that had once been the backdrop for their precarious family life now echoed with her inconsolable weeping. She was convinced that the spirit of her husband lingered. After all, he had often spoken of feeling the presence of historical figures in the house, and he himself had experienced a strange premonition, a dream of lying in state while a crowd of mourners gathered, a dream that had become devastating reality. Mary's conviction, fueled by spiritualism and despair, was perhaps the first acknowledgement that the 16th president had not entirely departed. The White House staff, who had witnessed Lincoln's descent into weariness, now spoke in hushed tones of the strange stillness that settled over the building. They described an unnatural quiet in the usually bustling corridors, a heavy, residual energy left behind by the man whose presence had been so palpable in life. The staff, more attuned to the rhythms of the house than any politician, felt the sudden void, yet also the distinct impression of someone remaining. It was this immediate, intense period of national mourning that spiritually tethered Lincoln to his former residence. The sheer concentration of grief, the finality of his sacrifice, and the fact that the nation's heart was broken within these walls created an enduring impression. The White House was not just a house he occupied. It was the site of his Gethsemane, the unfinished work of reconstruction, the saving of the Union. This was the mission that he could not abandon, even in death. His presence, felt first as an echo of sorrow, quickly transformed into the more concrete belief in a lingering presence, setting the stage for the century of spectral encounters that would follow. Decades after Lincoln's tragic death, the White House had cycled through numerous administrations, each leaving its own mark on the historic residence. Yet, the persistent whispers of a ghostly occupant never truly faded. It was during the tumultuous years of the Great Depression and the looming shadow of World War II, under the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, that one of the most compelling and credible accounts of Lincoln's ghost emerged, directly from the First Lady herself, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor, a woman of sharp intellect and practical sensibilities, was not prone to flights of fancy or superstitious beliefs. Her days were filled with relentless social work, political engagements, and the immense responsibilities of her position. Yet, even her rational mind was confronted with experiences within the White House that defied logical explanation. Her first and most distinct encounters occurred in the Lincoln bedroom, which was originally Lincoln's office and later became a guest room. Eleanor often used this room for her own work, finding its quiet solitude conducive to writing and reflection. It was here that she reported feeling a distinct, cold presence in the room, particularly near the fireplace where Lincoln himself had spent countless hours. She would describe a heavy, almost mournful energy, as if the very air still held the echoes of past sorrow and profound thought. More strikingly, Eleanor spoke of her dogs reacting oddly in the room. Her terrier, Fala, a usually boisterous and fearless dog, would sometimes refuse to enter the Lincoln bedroom or, if coaxed inside, would whimper and stare intently at empty corners, his hackles raised. This animal intuition, often cited in paranormal accounts, gave Eleanor pause. She couldn't dismiss it as imagination if her loyal companion was also sensing something unseen. Perhaps the most direct of her accounts, though, involved a sense of being watched, a palpable feeling of an unseen observer in the room. She would feel a distinct chill, an almost physical touch, and the sensation that a tall, somber figure was standing over her. While she never claimed to have seen Lincoln's full apparition in the traditional sense, her testimony was incredibly powerful because it came from a person so grounded in reality. She described it as an unmistakable feeling that Lincoln was still there observing, perhaps still pondering the fate of the nation. Eleanor Roosevelt publicly shared these experiences, not as sensational tales, but as genuine, perplexing occurrences within the executive mansion. Her credibility lent immense weight to the growing legend of the Lincoln ghost. If even the pragmatic First Lady, deeply engaged with the pressing issues of her time, felt the lingering presence of the 16th president, then surely there was something more to the White House than just bricks and mortar. It suggested that Lincoln's profound connection to the House and his unfinished mission had indeed left an indelible, spectral mark, a silent sentinel watching over the nation he had saved. The White House, already charged with the specter of the Civil War, became the epicenter of global strategy during World War II. In 1941, following America's entry into the conflict, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill became a frequent and crucial guest of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Churchill, a man whose courage was legendary and whose resolve was unbreakable, was certainly not one to be easily rattled by superstitious tales. He was known for his love of fine cigars, whiskey, and late-night work, habits that often led him to retire well past the midnight hour. During his stays, Churchill was often accommodated in the famed Lincoln bedroom, sleeping beneath the massive, ornately carved Victorian bed once used by the president himself. Given the gravity of the global situation, the Prime Minister carried the immense pressure of leading a nation under siege. His mind was constantly strategizing, his nerves taut. The most famous encounter is said to have occurred one evening after a particularly long session of war planning. Churchill had retired, indulging in his ritual of a late-night bath. He emerged from the bathroom, naked save for a towel wrapped around his waist, and crossed the room toward the bed, perhaps anticipating a brief moment of rest before the next day's demands. As he entered the main chamber of the Lincoln bedroom, his eyes fell upon a figure standing near the fireplace. It was the distinct form of a tall man in a long black coat, leaning against the mantelpiece. The figure was unmistakable. The melancholy, weary face and the signature stovepipe hat indicated only one person, Abraham Lincoln. The apparition, described as translucent but profoundly real, was simply standing there, staring out the window toward the battlements of the Potomac, lost in what seemed like quiet contemplation. It was a silent, solemn presence that radiated the weight of the past. Churchill, for all his bravado, was taken completely by surprise. Instead of fleeing or screaming, his quick-witted, pugnacious nature took over. The Prime Minister, according to the popular recounting of the story, paused, took his cigar out of his mouth, and famously addressed the spectral president with quintessential British directness. "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." As soon as the words were spoken, or perhaps because the living had dared to acknowledge him, the translucent figure slowly faded into the wall. Churchill, utterly unnerved, reportedly threw the cigar down, refused to ever sleep in the Lincoln bedroom again, and for a long time kept the story privately. The man who faced down Hitler with unflinching courage had been momentarily paralyzed by the ghost of a president who had faced down disunion. This high-stakes, cross-century encounter between two titans of democracy solidified the legend. It was no longer a tale whispered by fearful staff. It was a confirmed, though inexplicable, event witnessed by one of the most important world leaders of the 20th century, firmly embedding the ghost of Abraham Lincoln into the international lexicon of historical hauntings. For every high-profile encounter like Winston Churchill's, there existed a counter-narrative of official skepticism and outright denial from the various administrations. Presidents, particularly those of a more pragmatic or military mindset, often dismissed the rumors as fanciful stories or the product of stress and overwork. They preferred to maintain the dignity of the executive mansion, not the sensationalism of a haunted house. President William Howard Taft, for instance, openly disapproved of the ghostly rumors that circulated among his domestic staff in the early 20th century, going so far as to instruct his military aide to threaten termination for anyone caught spreading the tales. Later presidents, while perhaps more privately intrigued, generally maintained a public stance of rational disbelief, viewing the stories as amusing folklore rather than verifiable fact. The ghost of Abraham Lincoln, they implied, was a charming legend, nothing more. However, the stories persisted, not from tourists or journalists, but from the one group whose experience of the White House was both intimate and continuous: the career staff. The butlers, valets, cooks, maids, and maintenance crews, often working long, lonely hours in the quiet depths of the night, were the true keepers of the mansion's secrets. Unlike the first families, who moved in and out every 4 or 8 years, the staff's tenure spanned decades, providing an unbroken oral tradition of paranormal activity. One of the most compelling early witnesses was Jeremiah "Jerry" Smith, a White House employee who served for nearly 4 decades starting in the late 1860s. Smith, known as the official duster, claimed to have seen Lincoln's figure silently gliding down the halls, always with a sad, serious expression. His accounts, often shared with reporters on slow news days, established an early baseline for the ghost's appearance and melancholy demeanor. The staff's encounters were often less dramatic than the presidential sightings, but far more frequent and often terrifying. They reported the smell of wood smoke in rooms with no fireplace lit, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing the upper floor late at night, and most chillingly, the persistent, soft weeping attributed to Mary Todd Lincoln near the Red Room, where she held her desperate seances. One famous account involves a secretary to Eleanor Roosevelt, Mary Eben, who claimed to have seen Lincoln sitting on the edge of the Lincoln bedroom bed, slowly pulling on his boots. This intimate, domestic image of the president, deeply focused on a mundane task, was so vivid that Eben reportedly ran screaming from the room, never to return. Another account involves one of Franklin Roosevelt's personal valets, who fled the premises in a panic after a sighting. The sheer volume and consistency of these staff accounts, transcending different administrations and generations, provided the confirmation from within that the high-profile guests often needed to believe. They were the ones who knew the house's quirks, the drafts, and the settling noises, and yet still insisted that something more, something spectral and presidential, remained, tied irrevocably to the center of American power. The staff's fear was the authentic evidence that official denials could never completely erase. To understand the intense concentration of paranormal activity in the Lincoln bedroom, one must first recognize its historical significance. Contrary to its current designation as a guest suite, this second-floor corner room was, during Lincoln's tenure, his most private and heavily used workspace. His executive office and cabinet room. It was not a place of sleep, but a chamber of relentless anxiety and profound decision-making, and this history is precisely what anchors his spectral presence there. It was within these four walls that the Civil War maps were spread out, marking the grim progress of battles like Gettysburg and Antietam. Here, Lincoln paced the floorboards, agonizing over military strategies and the overwhelming casualty lists. Most crucially, it was on a desk in this very room that he polished and ultimately signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, forever changing the course of the nation and fulfilling his life's most profound mission. The sheer volume of stress, deliberation, and historical weight concentrated in this small space imbues it with an almost tangible energy. After the White House renovations under President Harry S. Truman, the magnificent, high-backed rosewood bed, purchased by Mary Todd Lincoln for use in a guest room, was placed in Lincoln's former office, renaming it the Lincoln bedroom. This act of preservation, while honoring his memory, also unwittingly created a powerful focus point for the ghost story, merging the president's working history with the intimate, vulnerable atmosphere of a sleeping chamber. It is here, in this room steeped in his legacy, that the vast majority of the most compelling sightings have occurred. Guests, ranging from world leaders like Winston Churchill to White House secretaries like Mary Eben, have reported seeing the tall, somber figure of the 16th president. The sightings share a common, uncanny consistency. The ghost is often seen either standing silently by the south-facing window, staring out toward the Potomac, the same view Lincoln contemplated during the war, or sitting on the edge of the large bed, often engaged in the mundane, intimate action of pulling on his boots. The significance of these actions is paramount. The window gazing suggests a perpetual sentinel, a commander still watching over the fate of the Republic. The image of him donning his boots, however, is intensely personal. It suggests a man who is forever preparing to face the day's duties, who cannot fully rest because his work remains unfinished. The haunting in the Lincoln bedroom is not a random, scary poltergeist. It is a dedicated, sorrowful presence, perpetually tied to the room where he spent his most intense, life-altering hours. It is the spiritual residue of a president who was too burdened by his office to ever truly check out, even in death. The Lincoln haunting achieved true international notoriety, not just through the accounts of American politicians and British prime ministers, but through a truly regal and unexpected witness, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. During World War II, the Dutch queen was forced into exile following the Nazi occupation of her country. She became a high-profile guest at the White House, relying on the solidarity of the Roosevelt administration while fighting for her nation's liberation. Her presence underscored the global struggle for democracy, making her sudden confrontation with Lincoln's spirit all the more poignant. The Queen, known for her formidable spirit and iron will, was accustomed to the gravitas of historical residences, but nothing could have prepared her for the spectral inhabitant of the American Executive Mansion. On one particular night, during a period of deep anxiety over the war's progress in Europe, Queen Wilhelmina was awakened by a sharp, persistent knocking on the door of her assigned bedroom. Assuming it was an urgent message from her staff or an aide to President Roosevelt, she rose from her bed and went to open the door. Standing directly outside, however, was not a uniformed messenger or a concerned attendant. Instead, she was confronted by the figure of a tall, somber man dressed in old-fashioned dark clothing, his face etched with a familiar, profound melancholy. It was unmistakably the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. The apparition's proximity and silence were intensely unnerving. Unlike the distant sightings others had reported, this was a direct, face-to-face encounter right on the threshold of her room. According to the accounts, the Queen, instead of offering a diplomatic greeting or recoiling in fear, let out a sharp, involuntary shriek of shock. She reportedly fainted, collapsing backward into her room. When she was revived, she recounted her terrifying experience to a stunned White House staff. The Queen was a woman of immense stature and dignity. Her testimony could not be lightly dismissed. Her confrontation suggested that Lincoln's presence was not confined merely to his former office, the Lincoln bedroom, but that his spirit moved throughout the second floor, perhaps drawn to the individuals, like herself and Churchill, who were also bearing the immense burden of leading a nation through a brutal, existential war. The Queen's startling confrontation added a new, dramatic layer to the Lincoln ghost story. It transformed the apparition from a passive, pacing figure into an entity capable of direct, frightening interaction. The Dutch treat, as the anecdote became known among staff, cemented the belief that Lincoln was a conscious, deliberate presence, still performing a solemn, watchful duty in the most important house in America. His spirit, it seemed, sought out those who understood the price of leadership, offering a silent, spectral solidarity to those who fought for the continuation of freedom and democracy. Following the high-stakes encounters of the war years, the legend of Lincoln's ghost continued to permeate the consciousness of those inhabiting the executive mansion, extending even to the presidents themselves. Two figures who followed Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower, offered particularly insightful perspectives that solidified the ghost's place in the house's lore. Harry S. Truman, a practical man from Missouri who unexpectedly inherited the presidency at the close of World War II, initially approached the ghost stories with a mixture of amusement and skepticism. However, his tenure included the massive reconstruction and renovation of the White House in the early 1950s, a process that might have stirred up more than just dust and old floorboards. Truman and his family were forced to live across the street during the reconstruction, and upon their return, he began to feel a distinct, heavy atmosphere in the newly restored rooms. While Truman never claimed to have seen the full apparition, he frequently wrote letters to his wife, Bess, describing the unsettling noises he heard late at night. He mentioned mysterious footsteps pacing directly above him on the second floor when he knew the area to be empty, and unexplained knocks echoing in the silent corridors. In one famous letter, Truman joked about the experience, writing, "I'm sitting here in the great big house, and I can't get away from the feeling that Lincoln walks these halls at night." Despite the humorous tone, the consistent reports in his private correspondence reveal a genuine acknowledgement of a lingering, inexplicable presence. Truman's testimony focused not on visual sighting, but on the compelling auditory evidence of a former resident who never truly left. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the celebrated supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, brought a soldier's pragmatism to the presidency. Like many military men, he was generally dismissive of ghost stories. Yet, the White House was insistent on challenging his skepticism. While Eisenhower never publicly affirmed seeing Lincoln, he did recount an experience shared by his press secretary, James Hagerty. Hagerty was resting in the Lincoln bedroom one evening and claimed he was awakened by a distinct feeling of a large, cold hand pressing down on his shoulder. He sat bolt upright, seeing nothing, but the sense of a powerful, invisible presence in the room was overwhelming. This incident, shared privately with the president, contributed to the atmosphere of the house. Moreover, Ike's own staff often joked that the reason the president occasionally awoke early was because Lincoln's ghost had paced the floor above his bedroom. Though Eisenhower maintained a distance from the supernatural in public, the cumulative effect of these close calls and the sincere reports from those around him made it clear that the spirit of Abraham Lincoln was not merely an idle tale. The experiences of both Truman and Eisenhower, one hearing the pacing, the other learning of a tangible touch, solidified the belief that the 16th president was an active, if spectral, resident, ensuring the legend would pass into yet another generation of American leadership. The ghost of Abraham Lincoln is not a mischievous or terrifying spirit. It is a dedicated, sorrowful presence whose spectral activities follow a distinct, almost professional routine. Across the century and a half of sightings, the consistent nature of the apparition's behavior lends credibility to the belief that his spirit is intrinsically tied to the immense duties he performed in life. He is less a ghost haunting a home and more a sentinel haunting an office. The most frequently reported activity is pacing and contemplating. Lincoln's spirit is most often seen near the fireplace or the window of the Lincoln bedroom, his former office. Witnesses describe him with his head bowed, hands clasped behind his back, a posture famous from countless historical photographs. He is said to be perpetually deep in thought, revisiting the moments of profound stress and decision that defined his presidency. This pacing is frequently accompanied by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps in the quiet late hours, heard by staff and residents even when the room above is known to be empty. This routine suggests a president unable to set aside the burdens of command, forever wrestling with the moral weight of the Civil War. Another significant component of his routine involves the checking of the house. Unlike other reported White House ghosts, Lincoln's spirit is known to patrol the second and third floors. Witnesses have spotted him moving silently down the long corridors, his immense height and dark clothing suddenly materializing and fading. This suggests a man still overseeing the ship of state, ensuring the security and integrity of the Republic's heart. His movements often seem directed and purposeful, as though he is completing a late-night inspection of the premises. Furthermore, there are the more intimate and domestic moments, though these are less common. The sight of him sitting on the edge of the Lincoln bedroom bed, pulling on his boots, speaks volumes. It is a moment of preparation, an endless cycle of getting ready for the next day's battle. This action, so mundane yet so specific, reinforces the idea that his spirit is caught in the perpetual cycle of his working life, a life tragically cut short before his task of reconstruction was complete. Finally, his routine seems to involve an element of silent observation and solace. As Queen Wilhelmina and Eleanor Roosevelt discovered, Lincoln's ghost sometimes appears to living individuals who are themselves under immense stress, particularly those who are leading the nation or its allies through a crisis. He never speaks, nor does he perform acts of mischief or aggression. Instead, his appearance is often described as sad, silent, and dignified, perhaps offering a spectral solidarity born of his own intense suffering. In essence, the ghost of Abraham Lincoln's routine is a physical manifestation of his legacy. He continues to pace, observe, and prepare, a permanent, solemn fixture in the house where he experienced both his greatest triumphs and his deepest personal tragedies. His routine is a continuous, spectral homage to the duty that ultimately claimed his life. While the presence of Abraham Lincoln's ghost is the most famous haunting, he is far from the only reported spectral resident of the executive mansion. The persistence of multiple ghost stories, including the alleged spirits of Dolly Madison, Andrew Jackson, and even a young British soldier, raises a crucial, fundamental question. Why does the White House possess such a powerful ability to attract and retain spirits? The answer lies not just in the historical figures themselves, but in the unique power of place that the structure represents. The White House is arguably the most politically and emotionally charged residence in the Western Hemisphere. For over 2 centuries, it has served as the nerve center of American history, witnessing a concentration of extreme, life-altering human emotion unparalleled by any other domestic structure. This is a place where wars were declared and ended, where financial markets crashed, where laws were enacted that determined the fate of millions, and where presidents often signed their own political death warrants. Such intense, concentrated energy, fear, ambition, triumph, and profound grief is often theorized to be the spiritual residue that anchors entities to a location. Furthermore, the White House has frequently been a site of profound personal tragedy that intersected violently with public duty. Lincoln's grief over Willie's death, the attempted assassinations, the immense pressures on first ladies, and the constant stress of command all contribute to a deep, sorrowful emotional history. When individuals die with unfinished business or under circumstances of extreme mental or emotional duress, as Lincoln did, with the work of reconstruction still ahead of him, paranormal theory suggests their spirits may struggle to find peace and remain tethered to the location of their greatest turmoil. Adding to this potency is the physical age and history of the building itself. Built on what was once marshland and repeatedly modified, burned by the British in 1814 and extensively reconstructed, the mansion has absorbed over 200 years of historical trauma. The vast renovations carried out under President Truman, which involved gutting the interior while leaving the exterior shell, might have inadvertently stirred or displaced spiritual energies, leading to a temporary surge in reported activity during the mid-20th century. In essence, the White House is a spiritual capacitor, holding the accumulated emotional charge of 2 centuries of American history. It is a stage where the actors are not simply men and women, but presidents, generals, and their families, all acutely aware that their decisions shape the world. Therefore, Lincoln's ghost is the most persistent because his sacrifice, the saving of the Union at the cost of his own life, represents the ultimate expression of the pressure that the House embodies. His spirit remains as a symbolic guardian, a spectral sentinel forever patrolling the one place that perfectly encapsulates the sorrow, duty, and immense power of place that defines the American presidency. To focus solely on the chills and the startling nature of the sightings is to miss the profound cultural and symbolic meaning embedded within the legend of Lincoln's ghost. His perpetual haunting is not merely a sensational story of the paranormal. It is a deep-seated American metaphor, a spiritual embodiment of the nation's conscience and its unfinished work. Lincoln was tragically assassinated at the moment of his greatest triumph, leaving the vital, messy work of reconstruction incomplete. The challenge of truly uniting the nation, of guaranteeing the full rights of newly freed citizens, and of healing the gaping wounds of the Civil War was abruptly left to less capable, less visionary hands. Therefore, the spectral figure seen pacing the White House corridors is widely interpreted as the embodiment of that unresolved mandate. He is the president who could not rest because his job, the perfection of the Union, was left undone. The ghost's appearances often occur during times of profound national stress or crisis, such as the 2 world wars, as witnessed by Churchill and the Roosevelts, or during periods of intense political upheaval. In this context, Lincoln acts as a spectral sentinel, a silent observer who returns when the foundational principles of the Republic are under threat. He becomes a cultural touchstone, reminding those in power, through his sheer, sorrowful presence, of the immense sacrifice required to hold the country together. His haunting is a spiritual audit, asking every subsequent leader if they are living up to the price he paid. Furthermore, the ghost serves as a powerful comforting figure for the American people. In the 19th century, particularly during the surge of spiritualism following the immense losses of the Civil War, many Americans found solace in the belief that their departed loved ones still watched over them. The idea that the father of the nation, who had suffered the loss of a son and ultimately his own life for the Union, was still home in the White House, watching over the country, was a great source of emotional healing. He became the symbol of a father figure who never abandoned his family. His melancholy appearance is also crucial to his symbolic power. The ghost is never reported as joyful or victorious. He is always described as sad, silent, and contemplative. This perpetually sad visage reflects the enduring sorrow over the Civil War and the centuries of racial injustice that followed. His spiritual presence in the White House is a constant, somber reminder that the American experiment is fragile, and the battle for true equality and union is ongoing. In this light, the ghost of Abraham Lincoln transcends the realm of simple folklore. He is a profound symbol of American resilience and regret, a figure of historical martyrdom whose spirit remains tethered to the Capitol as a silent guardian, forever ensuring that the leaders within the White House never forget the terrible cost of the nation they govern. Here is the penultimate section of your narrative, focusing on the cultural impact of the haunting legend, under the subtitle, A National Story: How the Legend Shapes American Folklore. The enduring tale of the ghost of Abraham Lincoln has far surpassed the boundaries of a simple ghost story. It has evolved into a vital piece of American folklore, shaping the nation's cultural narrative and public imagination. This spectral figure, tethered to the very seat of power, performs a unique cultural function. It humanizes the presidency, mystifies the Capitol, and provides a powerful, tangible connection to the country's most defining historical trauma. The legend's power lies in its universality and persistence. Unlike obscure regional tales, the Lincoln haunting is geographically centered in the most recognizable building in the country, ensuring it remains perpetually relevant. Every 4 to 8 years, when a new first family moves into the White House, journalists inevitably resurrect the stories. This continuous retelling across presidential cycles, from Roosevelt to Truman to Kennedy and beyond, ensures that the narrative is never static, always incorporating new witnesses and modern contexts while maintaining its historical core. The story has flourished across various media, further cementing its place in the national consciousness. It has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and television specials, often portrayed with reverence rather than ridicule. Children learn the tale early, reading simplified versions that connect the solemn history of the Civil War with the thrill of the supernatural. This accessibility transforms Lincoln from a distant historical figure into a familiar, if spectral, resident of the people's house. Crucially, the legend adds a necessary layer of mystery and dignity to a structure that is otherwise defined by the cold mechanics of politics. The White House is a place of endless debate, legislation, and bureaucracy. The presence of a compassionate, sorrowful ghost introduces an element of the sublime and the tragic, reminding observers that the decisions made inside are imbued with real human emotion and historical consequence. It suggests that the past is not inert, but an active, watchful participant in the present. Furthermore, the legend acts as a form of cultural validation for the importance of Lincoln's presidency. In a nation often divided over the meaning of its history, the near-universal acceptance of his ghost reinforces his status as America's greatest martyr and unifier. The story is a form of collective remembrance, ensuring that the sacrifice he made is never relegated to dusty textbooks. When a world leader like Winston Churchill encounters the ghost, the story elevates the national narrative, confirming to the American audience that their history is significant enough to attract the attention of the afterlife itself. Ultimately, the Lincoln haunting is an essential element of American civic folklore, a cautionary tale wrapped in a mystery. It ensures that the memory of the nation's greatest crisis, and the profound melancholy of the man who resolved it, will forever remain literally and symbolically at the heart of the American political landscape, shaping how the nation remembers and narrates its own tumultuous journey. The ultimate meaning of the spectral resident of the White House rests in the concept of the unfinished work. Abraham Lincoln was felled by an assassin's bullet at the moment of fragile peace, his vision for Reconstruction, a Reconstruction rooted in malice toward none, with charity for all, only partially realized. His abrupt departure left a chasm in the national soul and a political vacuum that subsequent administrations struggled to fill. His haunting, therefore, is not a curse, but the spectral fulfillment of a duty he was not allowed to relinquish. The pervasive and persistent presence of Lincoln's ghost, the tall, sorrowful figure seen pacing the upper halls, forever contemplating the Potomac, serves as a constant, nonpartisan reminder to every president who takes office. He is a silent conscience, an eternal representation of the immense moral cost of preserving the Union. His spirit remains, perhaps, to ensure that the living occupants of the executive mansion are continually conscious of the fragile nature of American unity and the solemn responsibility of their position. He is the original sentinel, guarding the Republic not with troops or treaties, but with the haunting gravity of his sacrifice. The White House, once the scene of his deepest personal grief and most profound professional agony, has become his eternal station. He is the spectral embodiment of American history, forever tied to the location where the destiny of the nation was hammered out. When world leaders and presidents alike report encountering him, they are momentarily brought face to face with the history they inherit, a history marked by division, sacrifice, and the relentless struggle for a more perfect union. His lack of aggressive or fearful interaction is key. The ghost never speaks, never threatens, he simply is. He observes. This passive yet powerful presence suggests a spirit that has accepted its fate but not its mission. He is the quiet guardian, ensuring that the occupants of the house remember the full measure of devotion required for the task of self-governance. He reminds them, with every paced step and every melancholy gaze, that the promise of America is a perpetual, unfinished work. Ultimately, the legend of the ghost of Abraham Lincoln is a uniquely American tale of profound spiritual dedication. It is the story of a man whose love for the Union was so great, and whose martyrdom so complete, that his consciousness became eternally imprinted upon the very heart of the nation he saved. His shadow falls across the White House not as a fearful visitation, but as a hopeful reminder. The Republic endures, and the spirit of the man who preserved it remains on watch, a permanent, sorrowful protector of American democracy.